H.R. 1541, H.R. 2579, and H.R. 2711 are laid on the table. Do you use these first, or you want to switch? She wants us to get out of committee. We've got to do UCs. For purposes, the gentleman from Washington seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to have my name removed as a co-sponsor of House Resolution 319. It was put on that resolution inadvertently.
Without objection, so ordered. For purposes, the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I have unanimous consent to remove Susan Davis from H.R. 2783, please.
Without objection, so ordered. You ready to go? Ready. What purpose, gentleman from Virginia, rise?
Mr. Speaker, I, pursuant to the House rule, I would ask that H.R. 367 be brought up for immediate consideration.
The gentleman asked for general leave.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 367.
Without objection, so ordered. Clerk will read the bill. Pursuant to House Resolution 322 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 367. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holgram, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 367, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to amend Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code, to provide that major rules of the executive branch shall have no force or effect unless a joint resolution of approval is enacted into law.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, and the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, each will control 30 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Earlier this month, President Obama announced that he would once again pivot to the economy. The bottom line of his speech, after 4.5 years of the Obama administration, quote, "We're not there yet," end quote. The President is right. We're not there yet. Economic growth is the key to job creation and recovery. But America's growth rate is historically anemic. From 2010 through 2012, it averaged barely 2%. In the fourth quarter of 2012, growth was just 0.4%. In the first 2 quarters of this year, growth averaged only 1.4%, according to the most recent estimates. These dismal figures translate into deep economic pain for America's workers and families. The June 2013 jobs report showed an increase of 240,000 in the number of discouraged workers, those who have simply quit looking for a job out of frustration or despair. The number of people working part-time but who really want full-time work passed 8.2 million. That represents a jump of 322,000 in just 1 month. Worst of all, the truest measure of unemployment, the rate that includes both discouraged workers and those who cannot find a full-time job, continues to exceed 20 million Americans. That rate rose from 13.8% back to 14.3% in June. America's labor force participation rate has fallen to levels not seen since the Carter administration. Median real household income, meanwhile, is 5% lower than in June of 2009 when the recession officially ended. Median incomes are supposed to rise during economic recoveries, not fall. The Obama administration, however, has managed to buck the historical trend. Worse, median incomes remain 9% below the peak they reached in January 2008 before the financial crisis. The President is indeed right. We're not there yet. But what the President missed in his speech is that it is his administration's policies that are responsible for America still remaining so deep in this economic hole. To see how true that is, one only has to look at the historical record. The current recovery is the weakest on record in the post-World War II era. The contrast with the recovery Ronald Reagan achieved is particularly stark. 4.5 years after the recession began in 1981, the Reagan administration, through policies opposite to the Obama administration's, had achieved a recovery that created 7.8 million more jobs than when the recession began. Real per capita gross domestic product rose by $3,091. Real median household income rose by 7.7%. Surely the administration knows this, but instead of fixing the problem by changing its policies, the Obama administration knows only one response: double down, increase taxes, increase spending, and increase regulation. The number of new major regulations the Obama administration has issued and plans to issue, generally regulations with more than $100 million in impacts, is without modern precedent. Testimony before the Judiciary Committee this term and during the 112th Congress has plainly shown the connection between skyrocketing levels of regulation and declining levels of jobs and growth. To make matters worse, it is increasingly the case that when Congress refuses to enable the administration's flawed policies through legislation, the administration unilaterally issues new regulations to achieve an end run around Congress. The REINS Act is one of the most powerful measures we can adopt to put an end to regulation that wrong-headedly imposes the administration's flawed policies on the American people. It achieves that result in the simplest and clearest ways by requiring an up or down vote by the people's representatives in Congress before any new major regulation can be imposed on our economy. Some say the REINS Act will mean an end to new major regulation, even when regulation is needed. But the REINS Act does not prohibit new major regulation. It simply establishes the principle, no major regulation without representation. By restoring to members of Congress, who are accountable to the American people, the responsibility for America's costliest regulatory decisions, the REINS Act provides Congress and ultimately the people with a much-needed tool to check the one-way cost ratchet turned by the Obama administration and Washington's regulatory bureaucrats. I want to thank the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Young, for introducing this legislation and urge my colleagues to vote for the REINS Act, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 367, the REINS Act of 2013, and I will yield myself such time as I might consume.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, sir. As I noted during our extensive debate in the Judiciary Committee on this bill, it reminds me of a movie, Groundhog's Day. Yes, Groundhog's Day. I feel like Bill Murray. It's that day over and over again. We come back to the same bill because we've extensively debated this bill in the last Congress and bills very similar to it in this Congress. And again, we're here debating this bill, which by any sensible measure, by probably a civics student in a 10th grade or less, would know that this is a seriously flawed bill that will impede legislation and hurt the American public. It's based on a premise that regulations by themselves stifle job creation, a rather unique concept that we have come to debate in our committee and now on the floor. H.R. 367 threatens to undermine vital protections that ensure safety and soundness of the entire range of societal needs, from food safety to clean air and clean water, to workplace safety, to consumer product safety, to financial stability. It does this by bringing most important federal rulemakings, including those that protect the public in the way of health care, the Affordable Care Act, and the implementation thereof, and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act aimed at keeping us from the catastrophic days back in 2008 or 9 when the world was coming to an end because of derivatives. It takes the implementation of these two bills to a screeching halt, a result that would put at risk the well-being of millions of Americans, both from fiscal health and physical health. The REINS Act would require that both houses of Congress pass and the President sign a joint resolution of approval within 70 legislative days before a major rule can take effect. In the House, a committee of jurisdiction would have but 17 legislative days to consider a joint resolution of approval, after which it would automatically be discharged from the committee and sent to the full House. Certainly not enough time to do a good job of reviewing the regulations. And the House must consider such a resolution either on the second or fourth Thursday of every month, assuming that the House is even in session on that Thursday. The bill also defines a major rule as one of having at least $100 million economic activity or having one of a number of other economic impacts. And all federal agencies issue about 50 to 100 major rules every year. That means if the REINS Act had become law in this year, there would only be 5 days left in 2013 for the House to consider 50 to 100 major rules. And while the other side loves gas, as we've seen with the Farm Bill and THUD, they can't pass it. Given those traps set forth in the bill, no major rule would ever go into effect. This, in turn, threatens agencies' abilities to protect Americans' health, safety, and well-being. It's a way of stifling the opportunity to protect Americans. Another concern with the REINS Act is that the influence of industry lobbyists over rulemaking would tremendously increase. K Street would love it. Given the complexity of the rules at issue and the expedited time frame of congressional consideration, members would instead be bombarded with visits, phone calls, and talking points from industry lobbyists who would no doubt take advantage of the REINS Act's short-circuited process to shape members' views about a particular rule, probably within days of a major fundraiser. On top of all the problems with this bill, it is simply unnecessary. First, to the extent that its proponents are concerned with Congress's accountability for agency rules, there are already numerous tools at our disposal to shape agency rulemaking. For example, Congress can rescind or limit its delegation authority to an agency if an agency acts beyond what we intended. Congress can also disapprove a rule under the Congressional Review Act process, defund enforcement of a rule or an agency through its appropriations and authorization power, overturn specific rules through legislation, and conduct regular oversight activity. Second, to the extent that the REINS Act's proponents claim that the bill is necessary because the Obama administration has inundated the country with costly regulations, the facts simply do not bear this out. Just because you say Obama doesn't mean it's bad. Most Americans like Obama. He's been elected twice president. In an op-ed that appeared in the Memphis Commercial Appeal, Dole McManus cited Cass Sunstein, former director of OIRA, also known as the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, who noted that in President Obama's first 4 years in office, he has issued fewer new federal regulations than any of the 4 presidents who came before him, including Ronald Reagan. Moreover, the op-ed noted this president has revoked hundreds of outmoded rules that produce savings for government, business, and consumers that will add up to billions. Congress has already considered and rejected congressional approval schemes in the past. For instance, Chief Justice John Roberts, not exactly a flaming liberal, criticized legislation that was similar to the REINS Act back to 1983 when he was an associate White House counsel. In a memorandum, he objected that such legislation would hobble agency rulemaking by requiring affirmative congressional assent to all major rules and would seem to impose excessive burdens on the regulatory agencies. So, before Chief Justice Roberts saved the ACA, he spoke out on this legislation as well in giving us wise counsel. Finally, the broader premise underlying the REINS Act, that regulation stifles economic growth and job creation, is simply false. It's pretty incredible that the proponents of anti-regulatory bills like the REINS Act continue to make this claim in light of the fact there's absolutely no credible evidence establishing the fact that regulations have any substantive impact on job creation. But to not just take my word for it, listen to some respected Republicans and conservatives. Bruce Bartlett, senior policy analyst in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administration, said, "Republicans have a problem. People are increasingly concerned about unemployment, but Republicans have nothing to offer them. The GOP opposes additional government spending for jobs programs and in fact favors big cuts in spending that would likely lead to further layoffs at all levels of government." These constraints, Mr. Bartlett said, have led Republicans to embrace the idea that government regulation is the principal factor holding back employment. They assert that Barack Obama has unleashed a tidal wave of new regulations which has created uncertainty among businesses and prevents them from investing and hiring. He concludes, "No hard evidence is offered for this claim. It is simply asserted as self-evident and repeated endlessly throughout the conservative echo chamber as if you say it enough, people will believe it." On the related argument that regulations create business uncertainty, Mr. Bartlett has said regulatory uncertainty is a canard invented by Republicans that allow them to use economic problems to pursue an agenda supported by the business community year in and year out. In other words, it is a simple case of political opportunism, not a serious effort to deal with high unemployment. Now, that was Bruce Bartlett from Reagan and George H.W. Bush days. Susan Dudley, who headed the Office of OIRA during the administration of George W. Bush, has been quoted as saying it is, quote, "hard to know what the real impacts of regulations are." She also stated that she was unaware of any, quote, "empirically sound way," unquote, to assess the impact that proposed rules have on jobs. And during one of the many hearings held on this issue in the last Congress, the majority's own witness clearly debunked the myth that regulations stymie job creation. Christopher DeMuth with the Conservative American Enterprise Institute, the very conservative American Enterprise Institute, stated in his prepared testimony, quote, "The focus on jobs can lead to confusion in regulatory debates, and that, quote, the employment effects of regulation, while important, are indeterminate," unquote. The REINS Act is seriously flawed in its very conception, based on false premises that regulation kills jobs. Ultimately, it will only serve to needlessly heighten risks to the health and safety, financial and fiscal, of the American people. I strongly urge my colleagues to join me in opposition to H.R. 367, which I feel confident will pass this House and meet a timely death before it gets any light of day in the Senate. I reserve the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from Tennessee reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 5 minutes to the sponsor of the legislation, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Young.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 367, the REINS Act. Some of my Democrat friends want to characterize this bill as an anti-regulation bill. But a vote for the REINS Act isn't a vote against regulations. It's a vote for better regulations. It's a vote in favor of a smarter regulatory system. It's a vote to balance broad economic interests against the narrow jurisdiction of individual federal agencies. It's a vote to give the people most affected by regulations a louder voice in the democratic process. Now, yesterday, the White House threatened to veto this bill if it passes. In their veto threat, they wrote, quote, "Maintaining an appropriate allocation of responsibility between the two branches is essential to ensuring that the nation's regulatory system effectively protects public health, welfare, safety, and our environment, while also promoting economic growth, innovation, competitiveness, and job creation," unquote. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly why I introduced this bill in January. For those like me who are truly concerned about maintaining an appropriate allocation of responsibility between the two branches, regardless of who occupies the White House, it's worth noting the executive branch only derives its power and only invokes its responsibility to issue a given regulation when the legislative branch authorizes it to do so, and only in accordance with the legislation passed by Congress. However, this allocation of responsibility has been thrown out of whack because Congress has taken to the habit of passing sweeping, ambiguous laws that leave it to federal agencies to sort out the details. This is typically done for the purpose of rushing bills through Congress in order to meet a political timetable, or because certain members would prefer to avoid working through the controversial details. It's much easier to leave such decisions to unaccountable rule makers, after all. Obamacare is a great example of this phenomenon. As a minority leader said when she served as Speaker, "We have to pass the bill so you can find out what is in it." It turns out that's exactly the case. They had to pass the bill so HHS and the IRS and our veritable alphabet soup of federal agencies could tell us how the law would actually work. In fact, we still don't know exactly what's in the bill because we're still waiting on more regulations. If the REINS Act were in place, none of the major regulations that are issued for Obamacare or other sweeping laws would take effect until Congress approved them. This would make our regulatory process smarter for a number of reasons, chiefly because we currently regulate in silos. Now, when HHS employees are drafting a regulation about health insurance, for instance, they narrowly focus only on insurance. They aren't too worried about economic growth. If the IRS is drafting a regulation on tax collection, they are likely to focus narrowly on taxes. They don't take much into account of job losses and income effects. We need a Congress that can comprehensively look at these things, a body that can, in the words of the White House, protect public health, welfare, safety, and our environment, while also promoting economic growth, innovation, competitiveness, and job creation, all at the same time. So as we learn what's actually in Obamacare and other laws, why is it such a bad idea to ensure that individual, rank-and-file Americans get to weigh in through their elected representatives on the important details that impact their pocketbooks, consume their time, and govern countless aspects of their daily lives? The truth is, it's not a bad idea. In fact, I predict Congress would take the time to more thoroughly and publicly deliberate about these large, ambiguous bills if the regulators didn't get the final say. In the end, we'd end up with better, clearer legislation, and a diminished role for unelected rulemakers. More Americans could stay engaged in the entire lawmaking process and could voice their concerns in a meaningful way. And politicians would be unable to hide behind so-called unelected bureaucrats because the American people could ultimately hold Congress accountable for the rules coming out of Washington. I implore my colleagues to join me in restoring a measure of accountability to the democratic process. Support this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Indiana yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia, reserved. The committee will rise informally to receive a message.
The House will be in order. The Chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker, I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to ESCOM Res 22, providing for a conditional adjournment or recess of the Senate and an adjournment of the House of Representatives in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
The committee will resume its seating.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you. Before I recognize and yield to Mr. Connolly, I just like 30 seconds. I just want to set the frame for where we are. What we're asking is for all major rules and regulations to have to be approved by both the House and the Senate and signed by the President before they'd ever go into effect. That message is one of the few things we can agree on. The Senate agreed on the time we can adjourn. That's about what we agree on. 17 bills have made it through here in 7 months, and we're talking about 50 to 100 major rules. Not going to happen. I yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, up to 5 minutes.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my friend from Tennessee and thank him for his able leadership in this bill. Listening to our friends on the other side of the aisle, I urge them all to reread Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, because that's where you would take us. You would take us to a world in which there was no federal oversight of the food supply in America. There was no oversight on child labor in America. There was no oversight on workplace safety in America. And tragedies ensued. America's water, America's air is cleaner, more breathable, and healthier today precisely because of regulation. The narrative that all regulation is burdensome, it only entails a cost, it never entails a benefit, is absolutely false and needs to be rejected by this body. Sadly, Mr. Chairman, it's once again shaping up to be a lost summer for Congress, as a number of issues ripe for debate, not this one, will be left to wither on the vine as members leave town for the next 5 weeks. That's frustrating after this year began with so much promise. I was pleased to be part of a bipartisan coalition that voted for the New Year's Day deal to avert the fiscal cliff. A few weeks later, that same bipartisan coalition banded together to provide emergency aid to communities ravaged by Superstorm Sandy. Thankfully, our success didn't stop even there. We came together again on a bipartisan basis to reaffirm the strong support for the Violence Against Women Act after it had languished in this body because leadership refused to compromise. At that point, people were actually beginning to wonder if the 113th Congress had finally gotten the message that the American people want us to work together to get things done, not to just make cheap political points. But sadly, that progress was not sustained. The first fissure appeared after the Senate's adoption of its first budget in nearly 4 years. I guess my friends on the other side of the aisle, the House Republicans, who had repeatedly beat up on the other chamber for not doing its job with respect to the budget, are now dumbfounded that they in fact did pass one, because it's been 4 months and they still have yet to appoint members to the conference committee they claimed they wanted. Then the Senate managed to pass bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform, mirabile dictu. Our Republican colleagues may talk a good game on immigration, but that's all they've done so far here in the House. Not one of the bills in their piecemeal approach has come to this floor for consideration. And just recently, House leaders allowed extreme partisanship to not only derail what was originally a bipartisan farm bill, but to also cast aside a critical safety net that was founded on a bipartisan basis in both the Senate and the House decades ago to protect families who need help putting food on the table. The list of unfinished business continues to grow as we enter the final days of summer, but where is the urgency to resolve them? I was puzzled to see House Republicans bring up a so-called jobs bill that once again provided less infrastructure funding than we did the previous year in what was called the T-HUD appropriation bill. And of course, it wasn't a surprise. They had to pull it from the floor in the face of bipartisan opposition. Their parting shot of this week will be the 40th attempt to repeal part or all of Obamacare. That's 40. When we return from this ill-timed recess, Congress will have just 9 legislative days to reach a deal on keeping government open for business beyond the end of the fiscal year, and by that time we're going to be bumping up against the debt ceiling. We actually managed a bipartisan accord to suspend that debt ceiling earlier this year, but we haven't been able to rekindle that spirit of cooperation. Mr. Chairman, the American people aren't taking 5 weeks off like we are, and neither should this Congress. We can't afford another lost summer. They yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 4 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform, Commercial and Antitrust Law, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Backus.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and the gentleman from Fairfax, Virginia, has just told us we have avoided the physical cliff. I wonder if our children and grandchildren can take any comfort in that. I had no idea that the deficit and the debt had gone away. I'd been told they were increasing by billions of dollars every day. We have another difference of opinion across the aisle. Our colleagues are saying we need more federal regulations, those that are covered by this bill that cost $100 million or more. We on this side of the aisle think that we could do well with a few less more regulations. Yes, every president has added regulations, every administration, and we're supposed to say that that is a good thing. Regulations today cost $11,000 per American worker. Now, that's not taxes. That's not your Social Security. That's not their expense. That is just the federal regulations. 14% of our national income, according to Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, our former Congressional Budget Office Director, 14% of our national income is being absorbed by federal regulations. 14%. Now, the gentleman from Tennessee says there were all these regulations before. In the Obama administration, they passed very few regulations. Well, not according to Dr. Holtz-Eakin. He actually says that in the last 4 years, the Obama administration has added over $500 billion worth of new regulations. Boy, so it's not it may be Groundhog Day, but we're another $500 billion deeper in federal regulations. Well, but let's talk about one family. Let's talk about one family and what regulations mean to them. One regulation caused American families to pay $20 more for a bronchial dilator. $20 more. And that was despite the fact that in 1987 in Montreal, There was an accord, and the reason the FDA said we're not going to allow an ozone-depleting substance to come out of these bronchial dilators. So they banned it. And immediately in 2008, the cost of these bronchial dilators went from $6 and $8 up to as much as $30. Well, you know what the effect of that was? Let me tell you what the New York Times said. The New York Times described this as a rough transition to new asthma inhalers, because several million Americans suddenly were paying $20 more, and some couldn't afford it.
Chairman, I'm happy to yield an additional minute to the gentleman from
The gentleman is recognized for one additional minute.
Some couldn't afford it. I'll say the gentleman from Virginia, the gentleman from Georgia, the gentleman from Tennessee. Several million Americans were suddenly being forced, some elderly, some children, to pay $20 more for what had been a $7 or $10 item. And you know what happened? A lot of them couldn't afford it. And there were more asthma attacks, and there was more bronchitis, and there was emphysema increased. And that was despite the fact that in Montreal in 1987, there was an accord that said, number one, that substance in a medical inhaler was essential and was accepted from the accord because the ozone was improving, number one. But number two, even if you banned all non-industrial discharges of ozone-depleting substance, all of them, it wouldn't do any good. It would have an insignificant effect. And of the non-industrial discharges, the amount from medical inhalers was infinitesimal. Yet, we denied millions of Americans an essential health item.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Before I yield to Mr. Johnson, I would say that I could respond to some of the statements that the gentleman from Alabama made, but I won't do it because I have the highest respect for him. He's one of the finest members of this House. And I yield 5 minutes to Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 367, the REINS Act. I have profound concerns with the REINS Act. This bill would undermine the ability of agencies to protect the public interest. It is a continuation of the majority's obstructionist approach that led to sequestration. This deregulatory train wreck threatens to send us back to the days before the Wall Street collapse, a financial catastrophe that could have been avoided by responsible policies. This bill comes from the same brain trust that pulled a bill for transportation funding yesterday. Apparently, $4.4 billion in budget cuts is not good enough for these Republicans. And now we consider the REINS Act, a bill that would require Congress to have the final say on regulations. Stop and think about that. The same House Republicans that could not vote to fund transportation now wants to have the final say on all major rules. Never mind that Congress already has that power under the Congressional Review Act. Never mind that House Republican leadership tried this same maneuver in 2011. If Republican leadership truly believed in growing the economy and creating jobs, we would have come together with a grand bargain long ago. We could even vote on job-creating legislation to strengthen the middle class. But instead, this Republican Congress insists on voting on a messaging bill that will go absolutely nowhere. Few Americans are surprised by yet another Republican leadership failure that has become par for the course. Mr. Speaker, millions of Americans are still out of work. As we go back to our districts over the recess, I hope my Republican colleagues can look into the eyes of the poor and the unemployed in their communities and say, don't worry, I voted for a messaging bill to deregulate America. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Tennessee reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes on this job-creating legislation to a great new member of the House Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 367, the REINS Act of 2013. As a member of the Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform and a co-sponsor, I'm pleased to see a good reform bill like REINS come to the floor. Regulations impose hundreds of billions of dollars, in fact trillions of dollars, on family farmers and small businesses, which significantly affect our economy and job creation in southeast Missouri. Businesses and individuals face an uncertain regulatory future, and this gives them pause as they seek to start or grow their businesses to encourage economic growth and create jobs. The REINS bill adds just a little more certainty to the process. It allows these individuals to hear about regulations and give input to Congress before they vote up and down on an agency rule. As I travel across Missouri, I always run into business owners, family farmers, and individuals who have felt the sting of government and their overreach. With the over 170,000 pages of rules and regulations affecting their lives. The pie-in-the-sky regulations here in D.C. have real effects back home. The voice of the American people through their elected representatives should be the determining factor in government regulation, not from a beltway bureaucrat. I urge your adoption of the REINS Act. I yield the rest of my time.
The gentleman from Missouri yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you. I yield 3 minutes and 53 seconds to the gentleman from Connecticut.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 3 minutes and 53 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to oppose this misguided piece of legislation which would erect new obstacles and red tape to protecting American lives. At the outset, let me just reiterate what Mr. Cohen said earlier in his opening remarks, which is that Congress already has the power to disapprove any rule through the Congressional Review Act, through appropriations process, and through other authorizing legislation. H.R. 367, let's face it, is essentially an attempt to impose a procedural chokehold on protecting American citizens, and I want to talk about one of those proposed rules, which is now pending at OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is a rule to prevent the continuing litany of workplace fire and explosions from combustible dust. Unfortunately, the Rules Committee didn't see fit to allow an amendment offered by Representative George Miller to exclude that rule from the underlying bill. It has been abundantly clear for a decade that federal regulatory action is needed to prevent combustible dust explosions and fires. In 2003, the Chemical Safety Board found that protections to stop these explosions were grossly inadequate. The board identified hundreds of other combustible dust fires and explosions, causing at least 119 fatalities, 718 injuries over the last 15 years. And the investigators themselves are not alone in demanding action. Tammy Miser of Kentucky testified before Congress recently about how her brother Sean was killed in a metal dust fire at an aluminum wheel plant in Huntington, Indiana in 2003. She told us how he was left lying on a smoldering floor after the explosion while aluminum dust burned through his flesh and muscle tissue, and each breath causes internal organs to be burned even more. Sean wasn't the first to die at work this way, and he hasn't been the last. It has been more than 5 years since the Imperial Sugar explosion in Georgia, an explosion that killed 14 workers. It caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage because an unchecked accumulation of sugar dust ignited and caused a chain of explosions leveling the plant. These workplace explosions have not stopped. There have been 49 major combustible dust fires or explosions that have killed 18 and injured 131 workers since Imperial Sugar. More recently, 5 workers were killed in 3 separate events at a factory north of Nashville because an iron powder processing plant failed to abate repeated dust hazards. Each of the 5 left behind a wife and child. One had 4 children under 11. Another became became a grandfather the day before he was killed. Widows have called on their government to protect them, and that's where OSHA comes in. In 2009, OSHA finally started work on a rule to reduce the risk of these explosions. There will be small business panels, risk assessments, public hearings, and plenty of opportunities for comments. Despite the clear need to move forward, this bill would give special interests a new way to block needed protections, and they are already lining up to kill a rule they dislike. The sad truth is that the underlying bill is nothing more than an effort to put the powerful above the lives and limbs of working families and their widows. I urge my colleagues to vote down this bill. And if I have another few seconds, I just want to say we're now hours away from a 5-week recess. 640,000 DOD civilian employees are looking at Congress asking why they should be furloughed for the next 8 weeks, losing 20% of their pay, some of whom are doing critical work for our national security, and yet not once in the over 200 days since this Congress was sworn in has the governing majority brought a bill to this floor to turn off sequester and make sure that these people who are doing critical work for our national security can do their job. That's what we should be focused on. We should cancel the recess, turn off sequester, and end the endless debate about bills that are headed nowhere. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Connecticut yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of the REINS Act. The REINS Act is needed, frankly, because for decades now, Congress has abdicated its responsibility for lawmaking to unelected federal elites in the executive branch. They often create overbearing regulations that stifle innovation, reduce productivity, prevent businesses from growing and adding jobs, and increase prices on everything from gasoline to groceries. Don't get me wrong. Some regulations are good and necessary, but they come with substantial costs, and there is not enough accountability for them. And I would look forward to voting for good regulations, and I would think my colleagues across the aisle would also look forward to voting for good regulations and taking credit for them. At this moment, however, the Obama administration has regulations in the pipeline that could cost the American people more than $50 billion. The Competitive Enterprise Institute estimates the regulatory burden to be almost $15,000 a year per family. Another study estimates that just 6 EPA regulations will cause the loss of almost 10 million jobs. These rules are written by unelected elites with very little accountability to individual citizens across my district in western Pennsylvania, from Elwood City, the lower borough, to Somerset County. The REINS Act requires your elected representatives to be more accountable for regulations. Very simply, if the regulations will cost Americans more than $100 million, then Congress has to vote on it. Good regulations will be approved and others will not. But your representative will have to declare a position, and you can hold them accountable for their votes. Mr. Chairman, the REINS Act makes sense to me. It makes sense to my constituents in western Pennsylvania, and I encourage my colleagues to support the bill, and I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask how much time is remaining on each
Gentleman
side?
from Virginia has 11½ minutes. Gentleman from Tennessee has 10½ minutes.
Mr. Chairman, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rakita.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chair, and I thank the chair for yielding the time. I rise in support of the REINS Act, and I rise in support of the man who introduced it, my friend and colleague from Indiana, Mr. Young. I want to start out by addressing something the gentleman from Tennessee debated and talked about just a little bit earlier. He said that we don't get anything done here. And I'd like to take some opposition to that. Just this week, we solved in a permanent fashion, Mr. Chairman, the student loan situation. And we didn't do it with Democratic-inspired price fixing. We tied it to the market. Now, it's true, it was very much a Republican bill when it left this House, and then it was wisely adopted by the Senate. in an agreement last week, and it came back over here for a final vote, 99% the same as it left. That's getting something done. That is real. But let's take the gentleman's point a little bit further. Let's say sometimes we don't get something done. Let's say sometimes we don't agree. The gentleman's solution is to let the unelected, unaccountable, nameless, faceless bureaucrats handle it, who aren't directly elected by anybody. That is an abdication of the constitutional duty of this House, of this branch of government. It is our duty to make the laws. It is our duty to make the rules. And not only is it our duty to debate and pass legislation, hopefully not every time with our names on it, but it's also our constitutional duty to oversight the executive branch, and that's exactly what the REINS Act acts to do. How dare we decide we don't want to address, we don't want to tackle the big issues, Mr. Chairman, because they're too controversial. Let the bureaucrats do it. That's not the way to run the government. That's not the way to run this branch of government, and that's not the way to run this House. It's time this body start doing its second and equally important constitutional duty, and that is oversight of the executive branch, and the REINS Act, again, helps us do that in large measure, and for that reason, I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Yes, sir. Ms. Jackson-Lee, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the distinguished, articulate, and experienced member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jackson-Lee from Houston, Texas, home of Archie Bell and the Drells.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes. Without objection, so ordered. Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank the gentleman from Tennessee for his distinguished leadership and friendship, and the chairman of the full committee, because I believe that it is fair to have a difference of opinion. It is also fair to say that there are times when we have a great opportunity to work together. And I believe that the gentleman mentioned my tenure on the Judiciary Committee, so let me document for my colleagues. The REINS Act goes around and around and around and around. It is constantly repeated and reintroduced, and it constantly fails. For the new members, on my friends on the other side of the aisle who are standing up and talking about what a great impact this would have, using old data and misinterpretation. For there is no real documentation that the REINS Act is going to stop $1.5 trillion in excess cost. In fact, the authors of the study that my friends are using was assessed by the Congressional Research Service. And I know when I speak to the American people and my colleagues, they want to debunk all of this procedure and say enough is enough. But the CRS showed that the study was flawed. But more importantly, the authors said we never intended for this to determine benefits to regulation. Our studies have nothing to do with it. We cannot document the $1.5 trillion or the billions of dollars that our friends say that they're going to lose. They know full well that there is a procedure of disapproval that Congress can respond to the needs and the questions of the American public. But what they do not tell you is that this procedure, oh, I hate to talk about it, please let me apologize. But if you hear it, your eyes will roll back in your head. For what has to happen now is that the agency is doing its work. The DOD, the Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, they are doing their work under existing law. They're trying to work on clean air and clean water, safe toys and safe cars, and safe workplaces. By the way, I offered an amendment to exempt children's regulations for babies 2 and under. And I was denied by the majority in the Republican Rules Committee, so that babies who need safe cribs and toys now have to have this happen. Let me tell you, unless both houses of Congress pass a joint resolution, let me tell you how long that might take. 2 years, 3 years, 5 sessions, who knows? And then such rule within a fixed 70 legislative day period. If they don't pass the joint resolution,
it kicks over into the next Congress. Meantime, babies' heads are driven through cribs. Those of us who are mothers knew that era. It hasn't stopped. Each time you have to look at the technology of cribs and be able to discern how newborns are impacted, or toys that they choke on. The Consumer Product Safety Agency can't effectively put a regulation in. Mothers understand that. Can you imagine a resolution of 2 houses of Congress? Right now, we can't even get a budget resolution going forward. I tell you what the American people want us to do, not the REINS Act that goes around and around. I think it was in the 112th Congress, 111th Congress. We're now in the 113th. We'll do it in the 114th. It does not save money. The American people want a solution-based budgeting process. They want us to go back to the budget reconciliation. They want to stop laying off, as my good friend Connecticut said, hard-working defense workers, hard-working Homeland Security workers, hard-working Department of Education workers that are trying to help this country be better. They want us to reduce the deficit. I raise my hand for that. That is a good thing. They want us to create jobs, and they want us to be fair to the middle class. I come from Texas. One of the worst disasters ever to occur was in West Texas. The tragedy and the devastation of the loss of our fellow Americans in an explosion that should not have happened. What was the cry? What was the federal government doing? What was the regulatory scheme in order to prevent whatever ignited that terrible tragedy, to see the loss of first responders? The federal government is an umbrella on a rainy day. Fix the problems of regulation one by one. If there's one that's undermining small businesses, we're happy to do the disapproval process, and you can be assured the voices of the American people will cry out. But I can tell you that there is no proof, no legitimacy, no documentation, but anecdotal stories of I hate the federal government. I don't hate the federal government. I pledge allegiance to this great flag and this great
time
nation.
is expired. Gentleman from
I yield as much time as the lady needs to continue to explain the fallacies of this bill.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I thank the distinguished gentleman for his kindness. I love my country, and therefore I understand that it is the umbrella on a rainy day. The reason why we had to reassess the Army Corps of Engineers and have a regulatory scheme, because we lost almost 1,000+ individuals with Hurricane Katrina. It wasn't the hurricane that had come through, it was the dam that broke. And I know it well because I walked those streets in 9th Ward, and I saw the baby shoes and the clothing hanging on closets and the whole area that was literally destroyed that killed 1,000 people. So regulatory structure, or what kind of oversight was given, what regulatory structure the Army Corps was working under, what oversight they gave, what is the regulational period that they had to review these kinds of structures around America. Then people wanted us to get in and get something accomplished. And so I'm just perplexed that there is no evidence whatsoever that this will create jobs, and it does not answer in any means about how this government can work better. I started to say to the gentleman from Tennessee that we all love this country. We pledge allegiance to the flag in our schools and in this body. And I wish my friends on the other side of the aisle would find some other way that we can work together. They talk about Obama administration regulations. My friends, they have been submitting this over and over again. And so these regulations have carried forward from President Bush administration. This is not the Obama administration. So let me close by simply saying, I want clean air. I want clean water. I want our babies to be safe in their cribs and playpens. And I'm appalled that they put this regulation or this legislation on the floor as something new when this is as old as Methuselah, and I might say having as limited value, as we would say in Texas, as something that would be very doubtful. I'll leave it at that, because we usually talk in Texas, and I'm not there now. But what I will tell you is we have ways of explaining how things are not relevant. This is not relevant, and it does not equate to state legislature at all. This is for the United States of America. You cannot put the REINS Act in place and talk about jobs. I simply ask that we defeat this bill and pass these amendments that have been offered by Democrats that want to make sure that we address the question of the American people. And I leave this podium by saying to the gentleman from Tennessee, is it ludicrous to put on the place of responsibility of the Congress a 70-day window for two houses to pass a resolution when we did not and were not able to pass a student loan effort for months and months, which, by the way, was made better by Senate Democrats? Is it reasonable?
It is not reasonable, and I reserve the balance of my time.
And I close by just thanking you for your time, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlewoman from Texas yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 30 seconds to say that
for 30
since
seconds.
1996, the disapproval process described by